You have no idea what it was like for us, the women, the wives. So opens Alice McDermott's new novel, Absolution. From these beginning sentences, McDermott delves into the lives and activities of military wives during the last era in American life, in which being a husband's helpmeet was widely seen as a worthy fulfillment of feminine ambition. Absolution takes the form of memory shared between two American women some 60 years after they left Saigon. Tricia Kelly was a shy newlywed in 1963, a parish kindergarten teacher who went to Vietnam with her husband, Peter, a civilian engineer on loan to Navy intelligence. Tricia, newlywed and in awe of Peter, meets Charlene, a strawberry blonde dynamo, a corporate wife who conscripted lesser females, like Tricia, into her volunteer army of do-gooders. I won't go into all the details of the story. This is a sermon, after all, and not a book report. But suffice it to say, Absolution delves deep into the lives of these American women living in Saigon over half a century ago. The novel explores humility, or lack thereof, as it plays out among nations and individuals. It exposes the lack of humility of an America at war, and the lack of humility in these well-intentioned expatriate women who buy trinkets and candy for hospitalized Vietnamese children, some of whom, unbeknownst to the protagonists, need medical care due to their country's use of napalm. Yet this novel also attends to the intimate, humble details of the lives of these American women, which the male-dominated military culture of the mid-20th century was all too ready to overlook. And not so different from the intimate, humble details of Mary and Elizabeth's story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to them in a minute. Tricia is very eager to grow her family and have a child, but she has multiple miscarriages. In the male-dominated world around Tricia, miscarriage is an unspeakable experience. Yet in this book, there is one beautiful and incredibly devastating scene. After Tricia has one miscarriage after about 3 months of pregnancy, Charlene comes to visit her. Gazing at that embryo together, Charlene baptizes it. In this way, Charlene fulfills not only the role of Elizabeth, but also the role of Elizabeth's son, John the Baptist. And even as the world-changing events unfold in Saigon in 1963, the lives of women had great significance to them, of course. And so the female friendship, the works of charity, bringing lollipops to children in the hospital, in some ways, when comparing that work up against the world-changing things that were happening, it may seem trivial, but it is not. It is as human and as complicated as what the CIA was doing, the men in the CIA were doing in Saigon in 1963, as all the world events that year were so rich in. Similarly, there is great significance in the ongoing human drama of reproduction. In the end, the chasm between Charlene and Patricia reasserts itself, and the reader is left with a sense of how unlikely, how otherworldly their collaboration was. Yet as American wives overseas in 1963, they had a great deal in common: the near total lack of agency or power, a choice between parroting their husband's opinions or operating independently in the margins, to unlimited and uncertain effect. What difference might it have made for everyone if those wives had been given a choice in the decision-making? Today's gospel begins to offer, through story, an answer to that question. For the story of Mary's encounter with Gabriel is similarly set squarely in the context of men and power. Of course, you may well remember Emperor Augustus's edict, which precipitates Mary and Joseph's travel to Bethlehem, which we'll hear more about later today at our Christmas Eve services. And the story is also set in the context of King Herod's administration over Judea. Emperor Augustus, King Herod, men with apparent power and authority over world-changing events in the ancient Near East. Now, I'm speaking in simple binaries of powerful men and overlooked women, but this is not about gender roles. For baked into the human condition is our encounter with powerlessness, with vulnerability, with feeling unseen. For I suspect, the story never says it, but Emperor Augustus and King Herod were also well aware of those feelings. It is in this context that the messenger of God bursts onto the scene. For the original audience of this story would have known, certainly, that Nazareth, where today's gospel drama takes place, was an unremarkable, overlooked backwater town where nothing happens. Nazareth was, in a metaphorical sense, a place of exile, a place where people's lives toiled on, but without remark or note, a place without power or prestige on the world stage. A place of exile, which is to say precisely the place where God is most uniquely, powerfully, and quietly at work. I want to make a note about this exile. We heard about God's affinity for exile in the first lesson, where David is ready to use his power to build something impressive, grand, a temple for God. Surely a good thing. But God's news, God's good news, is so good that we're never ready for it. We're ready for the grandeur, the power, the greatness. And God says, no. No. Because you know what? A tent in exile was good enough for me. That is where I live and move and have my being. And fast forwarding ahead, it's a bit of a spoiler alert, King Solomon, David's son, does eventually build a temple, and guess what? It's a disaster. He enslaves his people, bankrupts the kingdom, and it's a mess. There's a good reason why God said no to the temple. It's in the quiet ways, in the overlooked towns, in the unremarkable tent. To this young, unmarried woman in the middle of nowhere, that God appears and is powerfully at work. There are many remarkable elements to this story, of course, the most obvious and most famously being Gabriel's annunciation to Mary. However, in the world in which powerful people appear to pull all the strings, kings and emperors dictating the lives and movements of ordinary people, God works in an entirely different way. God does not coerce. God invites. It's worth noting that 400 years pass between the conclusion of the Hebrew Scriptures, also known as the Old Testament, and the birth of Jesus. Traditionally, scholars have claimed that, obviously, for those 400 years, God must have been silent. Not to put too fine a point on this, but I believe this view is nonsense. I believe that for 400 years, Gabriel was busy looking for a willing participant in God's plan. Hail Sarah, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed is the fruit of your womb? No? Okay, on to the next woman. Hail Hannah, full of grace, the Lord is with you. No? You'll pass? I think over and over, God was appearing, looking for a partner who was willing to say yes, who was vulnerable, powerless, but having the power to say yes to God, to recognize that her powerlessness, her smallness was not the end of the story, but rather the story's beginning. It's worth noting that not even Mary says yes right away. In our individualistic American way, we want to say that Mary was all in from the very beginning, had a faith-filled yes, pulled herself up by her individual bootstraps, but that's not what happened. Instead, she continues her conversation with Gabriel with a clarifying question. How could this be? It's not until she discovers her relative Elizabeth, an older, more experienced woman who can and does provide guidance and refuge for young, frightened Mary when she flees to Jerusalem in her pregnancy. Not only is it when she realizes that Elizabeth was also there to journey with her, it is then that Mary says yes. God comes to us in our vulnerability, but God does not expect us to do this work alone. We do it in community. Sometimes we are Mary, frightened and not sure what's going to come next. Sometimes we are Elizabeth, also frightened and also maybe not sure what's going to come next, but having more experience, a little more knowledge, and the ability to offer shelter and guidance to another person on the way. Something that I noticed in the reading this morning, the gospel reading starts with, in the 6th month, and it's easy to assume it's the 6th calendar month. But Gabriel says that this is the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy. I wonder if God's time is so recalibrated to those without power, those without note, that the story, that God's time centers on the women's time here, maybe not the calendar time of the emperor. So the question is, what new thing is God birthing in you? Remember, it's not in the places where we feel confident and powerful. It is in the places where we feel frightened, small, vulnerable, afraid, overlooked, in exile. That is where God appears. That is where God invites our participation, where all creation holds its breath. For a how could this be? Okay, yes. And we offer our yes, not alone, but we participate in the work of God in community. Over and over, this story plays out from forgotten Nazareth in the ancient Near East to mid-20th century Saigon to today, here and now. It is here and now that we await the coming of God, being birthed and grown in us. Emmanuel. Amen.